Translation is not only across languages, but across images, experiences, and emotions. Daisy Rockwell paints, writes, and translates. Tiffany Sao has a multi-hyphenated legacy from 3 continents. Both are gifted translators. In conversation with author and literary editor Kanishka Gupta, the intricate process and aesthetics of cultural translation is discussed in candid detail. Our first speaker is Kanishka Gupta, a literary agent, writer, and publishing commentator. Founder of Writer's Side, the largest literary agency and consultancy in South Asia, he is credited for single-handedly popularizing literary representation in the subcontinent. His first novel was longlisted for the Asian Booker Prize in 2009 and published in 2010. Our next speaker is Tiffany Sao, writer and literary translator. Her novel, The Majesties, was longlisted for Australia's Ned Kelly Prize, and her translation of Norman Erickson's Pasaribu, Happy Stories Mostly, was longlisted for the International Booker Prize. The moderator for today is Daisy Rockwell. She is a New England-based artist and translator of Hindi and Urdu literature. In 2022, she won the International Booker Prize along with author Gitanjali Shri for her translation of Shri's Hindi novel, Tomb of Sand. Please join me in welcoming Daisy Rockwell, Tiffany Sao, Kanishka Gupta for the session, Dhwani Resonance on Aesthetics, Art and Literary Translation.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute privilege to be in conversation with 2 brilliant translators who have done so much for translated literature. Last year was a brilliant year for both Daisy and Tiffany. Daisy won the International Booker Prize for translating Gitanjali Shri's Ret Samadhi into English as Tomb of Sand, and Tiffany Sao won two prizes.
Won one prize and longlisted for the Booker.
Yeah. She was longlisted for the International Booker Prize for her translation of Norman Erickson Pasirabu's collection of short stories, Happy Stories Mostly, and she won the Republic of Consciousness Prize. But a lot of people here do not know that both of them have been translating for a long time. Daisy has been translating for 25 years. Tiffany has translated 3 works previously. So my first question to both Daisy and Tiffany is to talk about how they got into translation and the process of translating some of their earlier works.
Well, I started out in graduate school, actually undergraduate year. I was in a Hindi class where the professor asked us to just try our hands at literary translation. And there was a mixed class with some very advanced Hindi students, and I was the least advanced. I was the baby. So he gave me Mohan Rakesh's novel, Andhere Ban Kamre, which I translated the first page of. And that experience stuck with me. I just felt like it was the right thing for me to be doing. It was kind of that moment when I found my powers, as it were. And even though I didn't go on to really publish any work, that was probably 1990, and I didn't publish any work until about 2013, because publishing is the path from translating or writing to publishing can be a long and arduous one. So I had many pitfalls on the way, but that was when it started.
Yeah, so it actually came about because I quote unquote failed in another aspect of my life. So I used to be an academic teaching English literature at a university, but also researching Indonesian literature. And the working conditions for my contract at the time were just so bad, and then the contract ended, and I decided that I didn't want to continue in academia at the university. So at the time I began volunteering for a literary translated literature journal called Asymptote. And at the same time, because my novel was being represented by my agent Jayapriya Vasudevan, who's in the audience there, she had asked me to translate some samples and suggest Indonesian writers for her to represent. So I began doing that, and that's how I got my first contract for my first novel to translate.
Can I add, because I'm also a failure at academia, and one of the reasons why I didn't publish any translations for a long time is because translation is actually looked down on in academia. You don't get points or credit for producing published translations, and it's considered kind of a hobby or a waste of time. And so it was only when I too decided that the path was not working out for me that I was able to turn back to translation. So in some ways that's, if you're looking for a path to translation, you could consider failing at academia.
So Daisy, I wanted to ask you about the meaning of a word in the context of literary translation. It's also part of the title of our panel, and it's Dhwani. You write very elaborately about Dhwani in your translator's note in Tomb of Sand, that how for some writers, the sound of words and how they echo each other holds more significance than the dictionary meaning, the literal meaning. So tell us more about what Dhwani means in the context of translations, and also while you translated a work like Tomb of Sand.
So I actually got the idea of thinking of Dhwani as a way of conceptualizing translation, but from Gitanjali. And it's within the text. For those who have read it, you'll know that there's a part where she talks about how translation is a tricky business. And there's a whole paragraph about how mangled things can get in translation, which people often ask me, well, do you agree with Gitanjali? And I say, well, not exactly, because she's not a translator. But then the paragraph ends, but the concept continues through a few more paragraphs where she suddenly comes back to translation, and she's talking about Ma listening to the radio all the time and it making no sense what she's listening to. So she might listen to Portuguese music or listening to a morning raga at night, and sort of nonsensical vibrations that are coming from Ma's mood. And she said, and then she says, but what about Dhwani? Dhwani is the hardest word to translate of all, and she's referring to the reverberations from the radio. But that was how I came to think of translation as Dhwani, because there's a lot in Tomb of Sand that you can't translate literally, or it'll make no sense at all, because she'll come up with a word that reminds her of another word, that reminds her of another word, and it's like poetry. So it's about the assonance and the alliteration. And we, after discussing this, Gitanjali said she wanted me to play with language the way she had. So I had to find the Dhwani of her language rather than just going into a dictionary and putting the exact meaning for everything. And I have come to think of Dhwani as a much better way of conceptualizing translation than a lot of other models I've seen.
Tiffany, my next question is to you. What are the kind of challenges involved in translating experimental works like that by Pasaribu and Bodhidharma? Is it that much harder to render the voice of like authors who are writing experimental fiction?
I think it does depend on what ways they're being experimental. So you can be experimental structurally, and I think there are ways to replicate that experimental structure in English. You'll just have to be a bit, different with the way you may structure something from, conventionally. But I think the hardest is when there is an experimentation with words. And you have to find and be similarly playful with words in that context. So Norman Erickson Pasaribu is very playful with words. And sometimes when I can't replicate that in one place, what I will do is I will move that similar playfulness to another place, just so that as a whole, that playfulness is retained in the story or in the poetry. But it just gets relocated from one place to the other if I can't capture it exactly literally in that one space. So that's been a very interesting
So also
thing.
Norman writes, he's published a collection of short stories, a collection of poetry. He's also working on a novel. So you translate him across, different genres. So tell us about the experience translating an author who writes across genres. And which was the most challenging book to translate?
So the most challenging was the first book. So it's a poetry collection, and it's called Sergius Seeks Bacchus. And it was difficult because Norman and I were just getting acquainted. I had approached them to ask if I could translate, and they agreed. And I also gave them the option of finding another translator, and they said, no, I have a good feeling about you. So we ended up staying together. But also, poetry, I had warned them that poetry wasn't my strong point. I'm a prose writer, so the novels I write are prose. And I'm very prosaic. I feel just that's my tendency. So that was, so I had warned Norman, and Norman had said, we can work together. And I think that has just, it set the dynamic for the rest of our translating relationship. We work very closely on my translations of their work together. I always give drafts. We're always doing feedback. We've corresponded via WhatsApp. We've corresponded simultaneously on a Google Doc when, on translations. We can see each other's cursors moving back and forth. And it's wonderfully collaborative. And the reason was because the first book was poetry, and because I felt I needed a poet's guidance, and specifically their poetic guidance to take me through that. For Happy Stories, mostly the short story collection, it was much faster, yeah.
So both works, like one of your major works, Tomb of Sand and Happy Stories mostly, there are some commonalities to the whole process of translation. First is that both Norman and Gitanjali are bilingual. They are very well conversant with English language, and they are very closely involved with the translator in the process of translation. And the second commonality is that both the works were translated during the pandemic. So just share the experience about, working with an author who is closely involved in the process of translation, as opposed to an author who does not really care about, how the book reads in a different language, or in English, sorry.
I had mostly translated authors who were no longer with us or were very elderly, so they were not that engaged with the process. And so working with Gitanjali was completely different. And I had always had these fantasies that if my author were alive, then he or she would immediately solve all my problems. So if there was a word I didn't understand, or a saying, or a folk tale, or like some activity, or some piece of food or something that's nowhere in dictionaries and I can't find online, I was sure that my author would help me out. And so I was surprised to learn that that's not always the case, that even though Gitanjali speaks perfect English and just wrote this book, there's so much that's instinctual about the way an author creates their work that they don't always have the answers. And so we would have these very roundabout email conversations where I was forced to ask her what she was thinking, what made her say something a certain way, and she wouldn't really know what the answer was, so I'd have to keep pinning her down, which I felt like was an unfair thing to do to an author. I would prefer that she would not have to explain exactly how a brain is like a jalebi, but I had to make sure that I understood how the process was working.
Sorry, Kanishka, can you repeat the question exactly? Was it?
So my question had two parts. One is that Norman is bilingual, and he was closely involved in the process of translation. He was reading your drafts, and so how is it, what kind of challenges does that pose to a translator, and how does it even benefit a translator when the author is also conversant with the language in which his original work is being translated? And the second question is about the pandemic, and the kind of challenges that translating a work during pandemic posed to you.
So I'll talk a bit about the challenges. I guess at first, I don't know, it sounds really awful, but at first I felt almost as if Norman's interaction with me was we had to argue a lot about things, and we were always arguing, and I felt very stressed. I was like, oh, don't they trust me as a translator? Why doesn't, but actually we synced after that, and we became really good friends, so it just became like not arguing as debating, but just
such good
conversing.
friends that Norman is translating one of her novels from English into Indonesian.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. But about the pandemic, oh my goodness, it was so stressful. Okay, I want to hear actually about your. It was so stressful. I have 2 young children, and at the time they were aged 2 and 5. And it was just, like the first one was doing kindergarten online and would burst into tears if we weren't sitting right next to him. And, Norman was being depressed where they were, and I was being depressed where I was. And we were both just very pessimistic, even though I was translating. And we're like, oh, let's hope for good things for this book. And, we're like, oh, I don't know. So actually, it was just very emotionally wrought. I think you can sense that. And it actually might have been a good thing for the collection, happy stories mostly. So just a spoiler, they're not happy stories. We have gotten some Goodread reviews that say they're very disappointed at the lack of happiness in these happy stories mostly. And in fact, it's meant to be ironic, but it was very funny because Norman said that the reason he chose that book is because for his very first book, which hasn't been translated into English yet, someone, said that, oh, someone should name these like very depressing stories because they're so depressing. And then, of course, Norman rebelled and named his next book collection Happy Stories. But it was very fitting because I think there's a sadness in each of the stories, and I feel like somehow like the rainwater of the pandemic, the depression and sadness and pessimism sort of filtered and collected in the translation itself.
Yeah, we actually, one of the things that was upsetting about the pandemic was I had come to a point in my translation where I felt like there was so much I needed to go over with Gitanjali that I needed to come to India and sit down with her and just do it live, like just sit with her every day and ask her question after question, because I didn't see how we could do it in writing. And then suddenly I couldn't go anywhere. So it became all email, and for some reason it never occurred to either of us to Zoom or talk on the telephone, so it was literally all over email, not even any chats or text messages or anything like that. But I think that the good thing about that was we have a written record of every single thing we discussed. We have it all written down, and that made it easier for me to edit and for her to understand where I was coming from, so we were able to go back and forth between these written records, and then she went over the whole translation in a Word document, and we had a record of that. So it was very depressing and very difficult to do that, and probably it's true that depression, she was also depressed and I was depressed, everyone was depressed. I'm sure it filtered also into our work, but on the other hand, both of our ability to laugh and to make jokes in the face of everything comes out in the work too. So we started to, I think, entertain ourselves with the jokes that, as they popped back up into English, made their way out of Hindi and somehow managed to pop back up.
My next question to both of you is, how do you decide whether or not like some of the words used in the original book should be retained or should be taken out? So this whole choice between explaining to the reader and versus letting them go on their own journey and discovering the text contextually.
Yeah, so I would say before I began working with Norman, I was much more a fan of gloss or of finding a translation. So I didn't use as many words from the original unless I was dealing with for something very specific, like food, for example, because I hate it when food is translated, because food is such a I don't know, it's such a visceral thing that when you translate it, it's just, lost. It becomes like something curry, and you're like, that's not very specific or appealing at all. But with Norman, I think I began, just letting go and being more playful at their encouragement. And so you'll find in Sergia Seeks Bacchus and in Happy Stories mostly a lot more untranslated terms. And part of it is because rhythm and melody is very important in Norman's work, not just in the poetry, but also in the prose. So to add glosses, in some cases, it's just too much. It breaks up the rhythm, it breaks the sort of sensibility or atmosphere in some particular passages. So that's usually when I decide to just keep the original untranslated and without a gloss.
I think it's the same for me, and it was also, though, I think, a process where there were certain words that Gitanjali hated to see departing from her book. It was, she's very close to Rate Samadhi, and she hadn't finished it that long ago. Very hard for her to see some of her language slipping away. There's certain words that she felt like that had to stay. And so we would argue about some of these things and come up with solutions and argue again. And I would try to for special words, certain special words like samadhi or kalpataru, I tried to bring them into the English text, even if I did translate them, to make sure that the readers who know these words, who read in English, would still find them there, and also because to help Gitanjali sort of manage the loss she felt of seeing the book transition into an English incarnation, as she calls it.
So Tiffany, as a translator, you have to steep yourself in the works of another author. How do you kind of extract yourself from that space when you set out to write your own works? Because you're a novelist too, you've published one novel and you've done a fantasy trilogy. So how, and do you work on translations and your own novels at the same time? How do you go about doing these two things?
I used to try. So I used to say, oh yes, I just work on my own writing during the morning, during the first part of the day, and then I work on the translations in the latter part of the day. Not a problem. And that was a complete lie. It was a complete lie to me, and it was a complete lie to everyone I was telling. Because I realized that I was I get very stressed when that's the case, and actually the day's not big enough to hold both of those things. So what I would do when I was doing that was just be incredibly stressed, be very inefficient with both, and then finally finish one, and then be able to concentrate fully on the other. So now what I do is I tend to alternate. So right now I'm in between translation projects. So I'm working on my next novel. But it's just too much to have the author's head, or words in my head, and then my own words in my head as well, because you want to do justice to the author and the author's words, and so like you're kind of living in them every day when you're translating, so it's just too difficult to do both.
My next question is to Daisy. So Daisy, as an artist, you are trained to see the world differently, and you might express things that cannot be rendered into words. So how has your life as an artist informed your translations?
Well, I think at first I didn't think they had anything to do with each other at all. But over time, I've seen a lot of parallels. And one that I like to bring up is when I paint a portrait of somebody, which I have done a lot. I spend a lot of time making it just right, trying to really capture exactly what the person looks like. But then there's a certain point when I say goodbye to that person and I move into simply interacting with the painting as its own separate thing. So I say goodbye and sorry to whoever I'm painting, even if I don't know them. And then I am making sure the painting can live on its own. And if you are familiar with portraiture, you know that if artists don't do that, then the person they're painting can look sort of dead, like a medical textbook drawing, because they're not being brought alive. You're just trying to get this accuracy of lines and shapes. And I think the same is true of translation, that if you don't say goodbye to the original text at some point, you will end up with a kind of a dead translation that can't survive on its own. You need to give life to the translation and let it live in the new language.
Another question for you, Daisy. You translate from both Hindi and Urdu, two languages that have so many similarities. So tell us about this experience of translating from two languages which are so similar to each other, and the many convergences and the divergences.
Well, I often translate authors from similar periods. So my favorite period is authors that were writing in the 40s and 50s and 60s in India and Pakistan. And many of these people knew each other, and they were part of the same kind of progressive collectives and so on. So there's many echoes, even if you're translating from Hindi or Urdu, and even if some of these works are not comprehensible to the other authors, you can feel the echoes. But I think the longer we get from partition, especially, you start to see more and more convergence, because people on each side of the border are no longer able to read each other's works, and there are all these movements afoot to bring in more coined terms for Urdu to get rid of Sanskrit and bring in more Persian and Arabic, and on the Hindi side to get rid of the Persian and Arabic and bring in more Sanskrit. So there's a divergence that starts to happen. But you also see with Hindi is a much younger literary language than Urdu, because it's really just Hindi as it is now. Khadi Boli Hindi, written in the Devanagari script as a literature, is fairly young compared to Khadi Boli written in the Urdu script. And so I like to say that modern Hindi literature is kind of like a raucous teenager that's experimenting and a little bit crazy and breaking up grammar and breaking up narrative traditions, whereas Urdu is sort of this stately lady that follows all the rules and all the words are in the dictionary. So even though I feel like my Urdu is weaker, my vocabulary is weaker, I feel it's easier to control the process of translation.
My question to both of you, how difficult was it to get Tomb of Sand and Happy Stories Mostly and Bodhidharma published internationally, because they are not the kind of books that Western editors and readers normally expect from other parts of the world?
I guess I'll start with Happy Stories Mostly, and then I'll talk about People from Bloomington. So Happy Stories Mostly, it actually wasn't that difficult to find a publisher, simply because the publisher in the UK, Tilted Access, who'd published Norman's poetry collection, Sergia Sixbacchus, was willing to take on Happy Stories Mostly as well. So we already had a publisher for that. But even so it was a matter of getting the first book, I guess, some interest for the first book, the poetry collection. And that was partly because we'd entered a sample for the English Pen Presents competition. And that year they were focusing on East and Southeast Asia, and we managed to get in. So at that event, I talked to a UK publisher, Tilted Access, who then turned out to be interested in publishing it. For People from Bloomington by Bodhidharma, that's the latest short story collection I've translated and that's been published. That was, I'd say it was more difficult initially in the sense that me and the agent who represents my translations, Jayapriya, had to really think about how to craft the pitch and the proposal and who to target. I guess, who would, simply because sometimes I don't know if you've experienced this issue, but sometimes translations are seen as armchair travel, especially from like underrepresented regions or countries. So for Indonesia, right, people are interested in works from Indonesian writers because they want to learn more about the culture or the traditions, or get a insight into the country itself. And People from Bloomington is actually set in the American Midwest.
There's no Indonesian character in the book. In the
Yes,
entire
that's
collection.
right. That's right. And they're all of the characters except for one it's a very fleeting mention that they're a foreign student, but Indonesia is nowhere in the book at all. So I had flagged this to my agent as well, and we were saying like, okay, so how will we go about, saying like, oh, buy this work by an Indonesian writer, but it's about the American Midwest and set in Bloomington. So that was the issue for that particular book. But I'm so glad that Penguin Classics acquired it and that it's been able to now get on the long list.
Long list of the Pen Prize. Congratulations.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, People from Bloomington is a brilliant book, and I recommend it really highly. As an American, I love reading these American stories written by an Indonesian and translated. I think it's kind of mind-blowing as a book. But yes, it's really hard to get anything from South Asia and probably Southeast Asia translated and published outside of Asian regions, outside of the Indian subcontinent. And I've been trying for many, many years, and really the origin of Tomb of Sand and its success is the same as what Tiffany was saying. It's Tilted Axis Press, and Tilted Axis Press was founded by Deborah Smith, who won the 2016 International Booker Prize for her translation of the Korean novel The Vegetarian. And her reasoning behind starting this press was to literally tilt the axis of Western publishing towards Asia and towards Africa. And so it's a very activist press. Its whole philosophy is dedicated to bringing these voices that we don't hear outside of Asia and Africa to a Western audience. And so she was scouting this book. She was scouting for Hindi literature to translate, and she read some of Gitanjali's previous stories and books that had been translated. So in both cases, I think it was this activism that brought our works out into the public, and both of these books have had huge success. So it just shows that the reason, publishers will often say, well, there's no audience for this. Well, it shows that that's wrong, because both of these books have found huge international audiences thanks to Deborah's efforts.
My next question to both of you, since you've worked with new authors as well as established authors, is there anything different you do while translating authors not too familiar to readers versus authors who have a great legacy? Is there more pressure on you to translate an author who's very well known? Another question is that do the authors, do the repertoire of established authors, do they have any kind of a role to play in your process of translation? I mean, do you revisit their old texts and see how their styles have evolved over the course of the books?
I think there is, for me, definitely that, how do I put it, with a writer who's newer, I guess you said, or like less established, I think, yeah, you don't have to think about the weight of their other works or, presenting them to a new audience in a particular way. But so, for Norman Erickson Pasaribu's work, for mostly I could just let the work speak for itself. But for example, the Penguin Classics edition of People from Bloomington, I was asked to write a 4,000-word introductory, scholarly essay, to accompany the work. And because Buddhi Dharma is, it's your chance as the translator to say hey, English-speaking world, this person is a big deal, right? Because you want, if they're a big deal, you want to be like, hey, everyone, this is a big deal, right? And not just be like, this is, to have them have no idea of the context. So it'd be like, for example, if you translated Shakespeare into another language and you're like, oh, this is just some guy named Shakespeare, versus you need to kind of introduce him to the context. You're like, okay, by the way, everyone, Shakespeare, big deal. So, for that introductory essay, even that took months to write, and I was reading all of Buddhi Dharma's older work, and I was looking up things from the archive, and, I don't know about in India, but in Indonesia, sometimes that archive work is really hard to find, so I was asking him to dig through his archive of, newspaper clippings and looking through, getting really old copies, like 1947 editions of like old literary journal, and photocopying that and looking through that for content for this essay and for all the footnotes I had to write as well. So I would say there was a big difference.
I mean, it's the same, I think, but this is also because we're both trained as academics that we feel that burden to contextualize an older classic author. And my first few translations were of Upendranath Ashk, about whom I had written my dissertation. So I obviously already had a lot of material. I had already done those things Tiffany is describing because I wrote my entire PhD thesis about him. But I think we do feel that obligation that when we bring the work alive into English, if it's a classic text, we want people to really understand why and to understand its role in the society it comes from. And sometimes people laugh at me because I compared Ashk to Marcel Proust. They say, how can a lower middle class Punjabi hero be like the protagonist in the, Remembrance of Things Past? But for me, it's not that I'm trying to sell the book as Proust, but more that I want you to understand that the same kinds of dynamics are at work in the book. So we do make these comparisons sometimes, not so much to sell it, but to contextualize it to help Western readers understand the role or like how this work comes across in its original milieu.
So how important is it for each of you to inhabit the context you are translating from? How do closeness or distance from context play a role in translation? Tiffany, you mentioned that traveling to Indonesia and spending time, with Norman, and also like some of the settings of his stories helped you in the process of translation.
Yeah, so I got the chance to visit Norman where they live and where they grew up, and a lot of things have changed since their childhood, but we still managed to go around, and I think it's just all of this process of soaking everything in. And I think also for Norman, I think what's very important is because they're a queer writer, and because I don't want to, and I'm straight, and I don't want to, and we're from very different backgrounds. He's from working class background. I'm from my family's very well-to-do, and I grew up very privileged. And I didn't want my translation to elide over or, produce a different, for want of a better term, to trample over their voice. And so that's why I think also it was very important for me to include Norman in the translation process and to have these dialogues and have them have full creative control. If they don't want something in the final work, their English is good enough that I'm not going to put it in the final work. We talk until we find a solution. And that's partly because I do think it's important, especially in Norman's case, to have their voice not be altered in a way that they don't want to. Yeah.
I've gone through a similar process with Gitanjali, but as you know, I couldn't meet her until after the whole book was finished. So that had to be a process of her describing particular things, particular recipes, particular bits of architecture. But when I've been doing my older books, I have, in fact, often tried to travel to places that where I can see exactly how things looked. I think understanding architecture is really important to translators, which a lot of people don't realize, but we have to understand things in 3 dimensions. So like if a door slams, what kind of a slam is it going to be? What is the door made out of? Does it have 2 panels or 1 panel? What is a gully? Is a gully a lane or is it a street? And I went to Jalandhar when I was translating Ashk, and I visited the streets where he lived and even his old family house to get an idea of the size of the space. And I went, a big passage was spent in Shimla. And I went up to Shimla and I wanted to see the Gaiety Theatre because there's a long portion where the protagonist is in a play of Anarkali in the Gaiety Theatre, so I wanted to see exactly how it looked so that I could make sure that I was describing it properly, that I was rendering his physical descriptions properly. So it's not just understanding culture or sayings or songs or dialect. There's also a lot of visual and spatial things that I think are really important for translators to understand.
We're running out of time, but one last question. Daisy, you've mentioned in many of your interviews and talks that you see translators as curators, and that readers should pick up or like not pick up a book based on what a translator, the name of the translator, and what the kind of books they've translated in the past. So I just wanted you to expand on this whole concept of translators as curators.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of us, especially those of us translating work that we weren't asked specifically to do, that we just chose to do, we have very high standards of what we want to choose. We have particular tastes, and we have particular capabilities when we translate. And unfortunately, bookstores and even online stores don't organize anything by translators, so it actually takes sort of an avid translation fanatic to figure out sometimes what their favorite translators' works are. And I would love to see bookstores have a translation table or a translator of the month, because when you go into a bookstore and you look at the spines, it's all going to be the author's book, so it takes quite a lot of doing to figure it out. And your translator is a curator, so it's like finding a list of books that has something in common, not just in style, but in a kind of artistic or historical or political concerns.
What do you have to say about a translator being a curator?
I don't know, just what Daisy said, basically. I mean, I guess because I'm in the translation community, like we kind of organize ourselves, like, books by translators. Oh, oh, these are Daisy's works. Oh, these are Anton Her's works. Or these are Arunava's works.
No, but all the books that you've translated so far, they are experimental in nature. Like before Bodhidharma and Norman, you translated Lakshmi Pamonchak, who's also experimental. So I would say that readers would expect you to maybe do the same kind of translations.
Yeah, not necessarily. My first novel was not experimental. I would say D. Listari's Paper Boats, which I love. It's very, like a fun read and stuff, but it's very different. Lakshmi's work, I don't know if I would call it that experimental, to be honest. I mean, it's not saying experimental good or experimental bad, but I do feel, translator as curator. I try actually to be quite open in what I'm looking at to translate, but I'm also just one person, so I actually have reached the stage where I'm not actually looking out that much for new work or different authors to translate. I mean, that sounds really terrible, but I feel like I have quite a full plate. I think what's really interesting is actually if you ask translators what translated works they like to read. I think that can be helpful, and also asking them what they think about the translated works that have been translated by other translators from their particular language or country. I think that's a useful thing to ask translators as well.
We can take questions now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Anju Gehlot, and my question to both of you, Tiffany ma'am and Daisy ma'am. The question is, in translation, how much scope for a translator to use their own discretion and interpretation, and what's its effects?
I think we do that in every sentence in a way, because honestly, no one is looking over our shoulder, not even our author. I mean, an author might look over our shoulder, but they don't actually care about every sentence. So translators have to take a lot of initiative and make a lot of choices, and we have to make choices for every word and every sentence. So we get used to that. We really, I think, have to be confident that we can make choices or we'll never finish the translation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And especially because I translate from Indonesian, and just the way things even are structured in Indonesian, like it's much more passive structure rather than active structure. And in English, English people hate this, the passive structure. So you're always trying to make a choice almost with every sentence, which are you going to keep this in passive or will you turn it to active? Then if you turn this to active, then do the other ones have to turn into active so that you retain the rhythm and all of that kind of thing,
Good afternoon, ma'am. My question is that while translating from original to your language, sometimes the original essence is missing. What precaution and what things you take care to maintain the originality of the book in your translated version?
For me, one strategy, if we're talking about practical strategies, one thing I do often when I've finished a near final draft of a translation is I'll read the original and then I read my translation and see if that feeling is still there. And sometimes I end up honing or polishing at that stage to make sure that essence or that feeling has been preserved, at least for me, because sometimes these things are subjective too. So that's the difficulty, yeah.
I think it's also, again, a question of confidence. The translator has to believe in themselves and take risks and believe that they are somehow going to find a way to convey the original meaning. And there are all different ways to do that. And I think that's what a lot of non-translators don't understand, is that it's not simply a case of accurately bringing each word in. There's feelings and there's rhythms and there's all different things that exist in the text, and we have to be aware of where that originality, where the ras, where the dhwani lies.
Time for two more questions. We have time for two more questions. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So my question is in three parts. The first one is for Daisy ma'am. What was your experience with translating the title from Samadhi to Tome? What was your journey, how you came with this word tome for Samadhi as an perfect equivalent? Second is, what is the place of translation theories in the literary translation world? The theories by, let's say, Friedrich Schleiermacher or Walter Benjamin, what's the place of these theories? How important it is for the translators, especially literary translators? And the third is, how important is for translators to empathize with the author? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. I'll answer the second one first, which is that translation theory, at least to me, is of no importance at all because it's not written by translators, so I don't read it and I don't really know what they're saying. The third one, how important is it to empathize? It's extremely important to do that. If you can't empathize, I don't think you can capture the original. And the first question is harder. How did I come to Tomb of Sand? Why did I choose, I'm always asked this, why did I choose tomb for Samadhi when tomb is just sort of one of the little meanings, not even one of the more important meanings of Samadhi? And my answer to that is that translating a title is kind of a different thing from translating the whole book. A title is could be considered a microfiction or a line of poetry, and it's also marketing. It's what gets people to pick up a book who might be scared of translations or unsure. And Tomb of Sand was a title that just popped into my head almost immediately when I saw Red Samadhi, because I was thinking of the Gandhi Samadhi in Delhi. So I was thinking of a kind of tomb that is not a marble mausoleum, but is a resting place that could be considered not completely permanent. And of course, if it's made of sand, it can't be made of marble. So it gives you a question, it causes a question to come into the reader's mind of, what does this mean? How could a tomb be made of sand? And that question is like a story, and that story is what makes you want to read the book, because you want to think, how does this happen? How is there a tomb made of sand?
I think we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your time and your brilliant insights. And let's have a round of applause for Daisy Rockwell and Tiffany Sao.
We would like to thank Daisy Rockwell, Tiffany Sao, and Kanishka Gupta for this lovely session. We thank ABP Live for their support. Ladies and gentlemen, Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to thank Daisy Rockwell, Tiffany Sao, and Kanishka Gupta. Tiffany Sao will be signing books at the book signing desk located on my right. You can purchase your copies from Full Circle. Please help in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bin placed across Hotel Clark Amer. Our next session is at 3 p.m. Breath of Gold, session 177, Hari Prasad Chaurasia and Satya Saran in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Please subscribe to the Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel to access all the sessions. And we'd love to hear from you on our social media, so please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2023 and tag at Jaipur Lit Fest.